Hello world and welcome to this video of UseEffect, the React hook. The reason I made this video is because UseEffect is probably the most important hook there is to React. It's pretty much the biggest game changer there's been to React since React first came out. There's a lot it can do, and there's a lot of things that it does that people don't realize it does, and there's some additional hook rules you should follow that people don't always follow, or they don't know why they should follow them. So I'm hopefully going to show you some of these gotchas and how to use the UseEffect hook properly. So first, I just want to get this straight out the door. If you are coming from React classes where you would use lifecycle methods such as component did mount, component did update, component did unmount, you might want to say UseEffect is essentially all of those lifecycle methods in one. And while that might be true on some levels, it's very important you differentiate UseEffect from lifecycle methods. Traditionally, lifecycle methods, what they would do is update the component based on where the component was in its life cycle. So when it first updated, I want it to do something. When the props have changed, I want it to do something. When the component unmounts, I want it to do something. UseEffect, you need to think of your component as when the state or the props change, how do I want this component to update? How do I want this component to constantly change per those props and state? So it's very important to realize that UseEffect needs to be always firing. It's not a certain time in the component's life. It's whenever the props or state change, this UseEffect is going to get fired, and this is how it should update the component. It actually helps your components be more future-proof without you even realizing it. So we'll get into that in a second, but first let's go into this basic example of how to use UseEffect hook. So as you can see, we have a useState hook, count, and set count, setting the initial count to 0. We have a button that when you click it, it's going to increment the count by 1, and we're displaying the count here, and we're also console logging it in this UseEffect hook. So as you can see in the console, this was fired on the initial render. So if we refresh, this UseEffect gets fired on the initial render, and whenever we click, it's going to get fired. This is because this UseEffect is getting called every single time this component re-renders. So this can be a problem, especially if we have multiple states. We don't want the UseEffect to be firing every single time every state is being updated. So for example, let's just create another state, and we'll just call it setCount2. And this one's going to start at 1, and we'll create another button. It says set count2, count2 plus 1, and we'll duplicate this too. And it's confusing. Okay. All right, so here's the initial state. We still only get one console log because it's only fired the first time. When we click the first one, we get the console log and with the updated state. When we click the second one, you're still getting the console log, but that first state isn't changing. That's because this is rendering every single time this component updates, whether that's through the state or the props. So in order to fix that, we can add dependencies to this UseEffect. So that's just a second argument in the UseEffect hook. So the first argument is a callback function. The second argument is an array. And this array is all the dependencies when this UseEffect should run. So in this case, we only want it to run when count has been updated. So we save it, you still get that initial count. And when we click it, we still get the console. But when we click the second one, it's not consoling because it's only going to fire when the count changes. Now, one of the common questions I hear or something is, or kind of doubts about this hook is, do I really need to pass in all of the dependencies all the time? Because there is an ESLint warning that will come out right here. Let's see if we can get it. Yeah, it says has a missing dependencies count. Either include it or remove the dependency array. So if you have a dependency array, which you always should because you always want to be optimizing your UseEffect, because that can cause a huge performance issue if you don't optimize your UseEffect. You always want to put all of the external factors within this dependency array. The reason being, you want to make sure that this UseEffect is always changing with the latest props and state. And so if you're consoling something that's external, such as the state, you need this to run whenever that changes. However, there's some times when you think, oh, I only want this to run on the initial render. So I'll show you an example of why that would not actually be the case and you want it to render whenever the props change. So I'm going to go to the index file and I'm going to open up this other file called initial effect. So in this example, we have an items and an item state with the set items, and it's initializing to a single array item in here, which is the label. We'll get to this UseEffect in a second. Essentially, it's just mapping all over the items and mapping over and displaying the text. So we have this wrapper function, which is controlling the number of items, which is a prop. Now, when we initially created this component, we thought, okay, so whenever this component mounts, I want to take the number of items and I want to create an array of objects with that number of items, which is what this is doing, and then put an object in that array, generating this essentially. So we wanted this to happen initially, right? So we just set this empty bracket. We do get the warning, but we don't care about that, so we're just going to leave it blank because we're only expecting this prop number of items to come in once. Well, now later down the line, let's say we get a feature request to be able to toggle the number of items between 1 and 3. So that's what this button here is. And so this button is going to toggle the number of items from 1 to 3. So you think, oh, initial effects has this prop, number of items. Initially it was just set like this, but now we can set it to a state and update the state. And we would think that when we click set to 3, it would update to 3, but it's not. The reason is because this number of items is not included in the dependencies. So it's never going to update. And while you might think when you're first creating the component, this prop will never change, or even if it does, I don't care, 99% of the time you want to always update when the prop updates, if that prop is included in this UseEffect. So this is future-proofing your code. This dependency rule, exhaustive dependencies, is an ESLint rule. You should always follow it. You'll definitely have coworkers question it all the time, especially people who are new. If you always need to include it, even though I only want it to run once. You want it to always run because you don't know in the future what changes may come externally, but you always want to make sure this component can handle any external changes. So we're going to set number of items in here, and that will future-proof it. So let's refresh it. So it starts off at 1, but when you click the button, it's set it to 3. So that's one of the reasons why you always want to have your dependencies in this array. Now, let's say there is a reason why you only want it to run once. There are rare cases like this. Keep in mind, this should be a last resort, but there are certain things like, for example, tracking. You only want this to track the first time the customer has seen this component or what have you. So let's get rid of this. Well, let's keep this for now. Let's just get rid of the UseEffect, and we'll say we want tracking to run once. And so, but let's just say it's passed in as a prop. So we pass in this tracking function, and we only want it to run initially once. But you'll see it has a missing dependency, tracking. You might think this is a function, it's never going to change. So you'd be fine, putting the tracking in here. So this would only run once. However, if your tracking function changed, maybe there's some other toggle feature that changes the kind of tracking it does, this wouldn't run again. So you might run into a problem there. Again, you probably never only want to run something once. You always want to run it whenever something's changing. However, if you truly believe that this should only run once, what you can do is you can set an initial state whenever it has fired. So we'll say const tracking has fired, and we'll say set tracking has fired. And we'll say use state false. And now whenever the tracking fires, we want to set tracking has fired to true. And then we only want to fire this if tracking has fired is false. Now we're still going to get the exhaustive dependency warning saying that we're missing some, tracking has fired. So whenever tracking has fired, this will run again. But now this will truly only ever run once, because once you set it, it's never, you know that the state is only getting set once because it's inside of this component. So you can truly believe that tracking will only ever get fired once. So that's how you set things only once. You do have to wrap it in a conditional and make sure you set the state so that it doesn't happen again. All right, so that's kind of it for exhaustive dependencies. Always follow the rule. Do never disable it, even though it might seem annoying. My coworkers sometimes call it exhausting dependencies instead of exhaustive dependencies, because it can be exhausting to work around this. But just know it is for your own benefit, for your code base's benefit, for your coworkers. You don't know who's going to be working in this. You don't know what features are going to be implemented in the future. But if you follow this rule, this will vastly help you reduce bugs in the future. I've definitely run across multiple times where this has saved me. One thing to note, though, while we're on the topic here of setting state within a UseEffect, is that this can cause infinite loops very easily. So, for example, if we did not have this logic here, and we just, it's kind of a bad example for this, but if we were just to say the opposite of tracking has fired, we're going to run into an infinite loop, and I don't want to do that because this code sandbox is going to try to run that as soon as I type it. But if I were to finish typing tracking has fired, the opposite of it, this is going to be constantly setting the state, because UseEffect is going to fire. It's going to change the state. Whenever the state changes, all UseEffects fire. So it's going to see that it's just going to set it again, and it's going to be an infinite loop. Be very careful, especially if you're on like Code Sandbox or something, because your browser will crash and it's really hard to get it restarted. So be very careful of infinite loops by calling state in your UseEffect. Let's see. Next, I want to go over the cleanup function. So let's go ahead and go to the index, and we're gonna load up this cleanup file. So this cleanup function, what this does is it runs another function whenever this is about to be removed from the DOM or unmount. So initially we are adding an event listener called click that alerts whenever you click anywhere. And then we want to clean this up, because if this component were unmounted, if the page were to go somewhere else, we don't want this to still be here. So in order to do a cleanup function, you just return within your UseEffect the function you want to run when this component gets unmount. In this case, we want to remove the event listener click. Okay. So lastly, I want to talk about using multiple different effects for your component, because there are times when you want multiple different effects to happen. But so traditionally, like for example, if you were to use the component did mount, you would have to have like 50 different, you could potentially have 50 different things in component did mount, because that's the only place you can put code that fires initially. With UseEffect, you can create as many UseEffects as you want with different dependencies that fire at different times. So let's take a look into the multiple. I already have it running here. So in this multiple example, we have basically the combined components of initial, of the basic and the cleanup. So we have this UseEffect that is not updating the browser API. This UseEffect is still counting every single time the component updates, and we still have the event listener in here. Okay. So you can just see we're using multiple different effects. So it's very important to break up your effects based on what dependencies you want. If you want everything to run whenever the count gets updated, make sure you put the count in the dependency of this one. But this UseEffect isn't going to get fired. This is actually going to get fired every single time the component updates. So you might want to put a dependency array of an empty array. That way this will only fire on the initial load, since there are no external dependencies in this effect. It's perfectly fine to do an empty array. We're only using the document APIs, and these are stable enough that they will never change. But this effect will only fire once the count updates. That way these are firing independently of each other, and we can still optimize everything. So I hope this video wasn't too confusing. I hope it helps. I hope this helps you use the UseEffect hook efficiently. Remember, always put your dependencies in your effect, and always follow the ESLint exhaustive dependency rule. Those are the main things. Believe in it, trust in it. That is going to make your code future-proof. If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button. If you disliked it, don't dislike the video. Just put a comment on how I can do better. That would be super helpful, and maybe I can make something that would actually help you and other people. If you want more videos like this, of course, hit that subscribe and click that bell to get notifications if you're into that kind of thing. Otherwise, goodbye world.